The buzzing fluorescent lights of Metropolitan General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the corridors as Jenny walked briskly through the emergency ward. Her feet ached, and the small coffee stain on her scrubs reminded her of how this night shift had started, with a spilled cup of much-needed caffeine at 7 p.m. Now, 15 hours into what was supposed to be a 12-hour shift, she felt like she was running on fumes. The night had been relentless. First, there was a multi-car accident that brought in 6 patients at once. Then, a sudden influx of flu cases filled every available bed in the emergency room. Jenny hadn't even had time to eat the sandwich she'd packed, let alone take a proper break. Her hair was falling loose from her once neat bun, and dark circles had formed under her eyes. "Nurse, nurse." The familiar voice called out again, the third time in the last hour. Jenny closed her eyes for a moment, trying to maintain her composure. It was coming from room 204, where Mrs. Rita Thompson had been admitted earlier that evening for what seemed like a minor case of dehydration. The elderly woman had been pressing her call button consistently throughout the night. Jenny had already checked on her multiple times, adjusting her pillows, refilling her water, checking her IV line, and even just listening to her stories about her garden. But with so many critical patients needing attention, each call from room 204 felt like a weight pulling her down. As she approached the room, Jenny could see other nurses shooting sympathetic glances her way. They all knew what it was like, being stretched too thin, trying to care for too many patients with too few resources. The hospital had been understaffed for months, and everyone was feeling the strain. "Nurse, I'm sorry, but my blanket has slipped again," Mrs. Thompson said softly as Jenny entered the room. The elderly woman sat in her bed, looking small and fragile against the stark white hospital sheets. The blanket had indeed slipped slightly off her shoulder. Something inside Jenny snapped. The weight of the endless night, the pressure of too many responsibilities, and the exhaustion of giving everything she had. It all came crashing down in that moment. Her hands began to shake, and her chest felt tight with frustration. "Mrs. Thompson," she started, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "I have patients next door who need urgent medical attention. We have a full emergency room. I haven't had a break in hours, and you keep calling me for a blanket." The words came out sharper than she'd ever spoken to a patient before. Other patients in the shared room turned to look, and a young orderly pushing a cart outside slowed down, clearly overhearing. "I have diabetic patients who need their insulin. I have accident victims who need warmed care. I have people in actual pain, and you're calling me every 20 minutes for things you could handle yourself." Jenny's voice had risen without her realizing it. Mrs. Thompson's face crumpled slightly, but she maintained a dignified posture. Her hands, spotted with age, clutched the edge of the blanket. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't mean to be a bother." The silence that followed was deafening. A few other patients quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't witnessed the outburst. A young volunteer standing in the doorway quickly turned and walked away, while the night shift coordinator, who had been passing by, stopped and stared with a mixture of shock and disappointment. Jenny felt the immediate rush of shame color her cheeks. This wasn't who she was. This wasn't why she'd become a nurse. But before she could say anything else, before she could take back her words or apologize, her pager buzzed urgently. Another emergency was calling. She turned and hurried out of the room, leaving Mrs. Thompson sitting there, still clutching her blanket, a single tear rolling down her weathered cheek. Little did Jenny know that this moment of frustration would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her career, but her entire perspective on patient care. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the hospital windows when the full weight of what had happened hit Jenny. She sat in the break room, her untouched coffee growing cold, replaying the scene from room 204 over and over in her mind. The look on Mrs. Thompson's face haunted her, that mixture of hurt and dignity that made Jenny's stomach twist with guilt. "You really stepped in it this time," said Nancy, an older nurse who had been at Metropolitan General for over 2 decades. She wasn't trying to be unkind. Her voice carried the weight of experience and genuine concern. Word travels fast in these halls. And travel it did. As Jenny walked through the hospital corridors during her next shift, she noticed how conversations would suddenly stop when she approached. Other nurses, who usually greeted her warmly, now gave her quick, awkward nods before finding reasons to hurry away. Even Dr. Parker, who always had a joke ready, seemed unusually professional and distant. The worst part was passing room 204. Mrs. Thompson was still there, but Jenny had swapped patient assignments with another nurse. Through the window, she could see the elderly woman sitting up in bed, reading a book. Despite everything, Mrs. Thompson's silver hair was neatly combed, and she maintained that same quiet dignity that made Jenny's outburst seem even more shameful. "Did you hear?" Jenny overheard one of the volunteers whispering to another near the nurse's station. The patient in 204 hardly touched her breakfast. She just sits there, so quiet now. She doesn't even use the call button anymore, even when she needs something. The words felt like tiny daggers. Jenny remembered how Mrs. Thompson had been before. Not really demanding, just lonely perhaps, wanting a friendly face and a kind word. How many other elderly patients had Jenny cared for who were just the same? How many times had her own grandmother, before she passed, told her stories about feeling invisible in her final years? During lunch break, Jenny found herself sitting alone in the cafeteria. Her sandwich tasted like cardboard as she watched other hospital staff chatting and laughing at nearby tables. A group of new interns walked past, and she heard one of them whisper, "That's the nurse who yelled at the old lady." The afternoon brought more whispers and sideways glances. Jenny threw herself into her work, trying to focus on her current patients, but her hands shook slightly every time she passed room 204. Through the window, she saw various hospital staff members going out of their way to check on Mrs. Thompson, bringing her extra pillows, stopping to chat, making sure she was comfortable. Their pointed kindness felt like a silent rebuke. "You know," said Tom, one of the orderlies who had witnessed her outburst, catching up with her near the supply closet, "we all have bad days. We all reach a breaking point sometimes. But it's what we do afterward that really matters." Jenny nodded, fighting back tears. She wanted to make it right, but didn't know how. She had drafted and thrown away multiple apology letters, each one feeling inadequate. How do you apologize for letting frustration override compassion? How do you make amends for forgetting, even for a moment, the fundamental reason you became a nurse? As her shift neared its end, Jenny gathered her courage and walked to room 204's doorway. But before she could enter, she saw something that made her freeze. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit was sitting by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, holding her hand. His face was familiar. She had seen it somewhere before, maybe on TV or in the newspapers. The man looked up, his eyes meeting Jenny's, and in that moment, she realized this situation was about to become much more complicated than she had imagined. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding. Something about the man's presence, about the way the head nurse was hovering attentively nearby, told her that Mrs. Thompson wasn't just another elderly patient. Jenny had a sinking feeling that her moment of frustration was about to have consequences far beyond what she had anticipated. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the hospital windows when the full weight of what had happened hit Jenny. She sat in the break room, her untouched coffee growing cold, replaying the scene from room 204 over and over in her mind. The look on Mrs. Thompson's face haunted her, that mixture of hurt and dignity that made Jenny's stomach twist with guilt. "You really stepped in it this time," said Nancy, an older nurse who had been at Metropolitan General for over 2 decades. She wasn't trying to be unkind. Her voice carried the weight of experience and genuine concern. Word travels fast in these halls. And travel it did. As Jenny walked through the hospital corridors during her next shift, She noticed how conversations would suddenly stop when she approached. Other nurses, who usually greeted her warmly, now gave her quick, awkward nods before finding reasons to hurry away. Even Dr. Parker, who always had a joke ready, seemed unusually professional and distant. The worst part was passing room 204. Mrs. Thompson was still there, but Jenny had swapped patient assignments with another nurse. Through the window, she could see the elderly woman sitting up in bed, reading a book. Despite everything, Mrs. Thompson's silver hair was neatly combed, and she maintained that same quiet dignity that made Jenny's outburst seem even more shameful. "Did you hear?" Jenny overheard one of the volunteers whispering to another near the nurse's station. "The patient in 204 hardly touched her breakfast. She just sits there, so quiet now. She doesn't even use the call button anymore, even when she needs something." The words felt like tiny daggers. Jenny remembered how Mrs. Thompson had been before. Not really demanding, just lonely perhaps, wanting a friendly face and a kind word. How many other elderly patients had Jenny cared for who were just the same? How many times had her own grandmother, before she passed, told her stories about feeling invisible in her final years? During lunch break, Jenny found herself sitting alone in the cafeteria. Her sandwich tasted like cardboard as she watched other hospital staff chatting and laughing at nearby tables. A group of new interns walked past, and she heard one of them whisper, "That's the nurse who yelled at the old lady." The afternoon brought more whispers and sideways glances. Jenny threw herself into her work, trying to focus on her current patients, but her hands shook slightly every time she passed room 204. Through the window, she saw various hospital staff members going out of their way to check on Mrs. Thompson, bringing her extra pillows, stopping to chat, making sure she was comfortable. Their pointed kindness felt like a silent rebuke. "You know," said Tom, one of the orderlies who had witnessed her outburst, catching up with her near the supply closet, "we all have bad days. We all reach our breaking point sometimes. But it's what we do afterward that really matters." Jenny nodded, fighting back tears. She wanted to make it right, but didn't know how. She had drafted and thrown away multiple apology letters, each one feeling inadequate. How do you apologize for letting frustration override compassion? How do you make amends for forgetting, even for a moment, the fundamental reason you became a nurse? As her shift neared its end, Jenny gathered her courage and walked to room 204's doorway. But before she could enter, she saw something that made her freeze. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit was sitting by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, holding her hand. His face was familiar. She had seen it somewhere before, maybe on TV or in the newspapers. The man looked up, his eyes meeting Jenny's, and in that moment, she realized this situation was about to become much more complicated than she had imagined. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding. Something about the man's presence, about the way the head nurse was hovering attentively nearby, told her that Mrs. Thompson wasn't just another elderly patient. Jenny had a sinking feeling that her moment of frustration was about to have consequences far beyond what she had anticipated. The hospital board's decision came down like a hammer blow. Jenny stood in Mrs. Chen's office, her legs feeling weak as she listened to the verdict. "We're placing you on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation," the hospital director said, her voice firm but not unkind. Outside the office windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital grounds. The news vans were still there, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Jenny could see a reporter doing a live broadcast, gesturing toward the hospital entrance. "I want you to understand something," Mrs. Chen continued, leaning forward in her chair. "This isn't just about punishment. Mayor Thompson has turned this into a platform for discussing elderly care reform. The video of the incident has over 50,000 views already." Jenny's phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from her mother, probably. She'd been calling all morning after seeing the story on the local news. The headline had been brutal. Elderly mother of mayor, humiliated by hospital staff. A sign of healthcare crisis. The thing is, Mrs. Chen said, her voice softening slightly, Mayor Thompson isn't just angry. He's disappointed. He told me how his mother used to be a teacher, how she spent 40 years shaping young minds, how she volunteered at the library well into her 70s. And now, at 82, when she needs care herself. The words trailed off, hanging heavy in the air. Jenny thought about her own grandmother, who had passed away 2 years ago. How many times had she complained about how the nursing home staff treated her? How many times had Jenny promised herself she'd never be that kind of healthcare worker? I need to talk to her, Jenny said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. To Mrs. Thompson. I need to apologize properly. Mrs. Chen shook her head. Not right now. The mayor has requested that you stay away from his mother. But there's something else you should see. She turned her computer monitor around. On the screen was a social media post. Someone had shared an old newspaper article from 15 years ago. The article showed a younger Mrs. Thompson, standing proudly in front of the hospital. The headline read, Local teacher raises $50,000 for children's ward. Jenny read how Mrs. Thompson had organized bake sales, charity runs, and community events after her grandson recovered from a serious illness in the very same hospital. She's been one of our biggest supporters, Mrs. Chen explained. Long before her son became mayor, she used to bring cookies to the pediatric ward every Christmas. Some of our senior staff still remember her from those days. The revelation felt like a physical blow. Jenny thought about how Mrs. Thompson had tried to tell her stories, how she had dismissed them as the ramblings of a needy patient. How many of those stories might have been about her years of service to this very hospital. A knock at the office door interrupted them. The head nurse poked her head in, looking concerned. You might want to see this, she said, holding up her phone. Another video was going viral. This time, it was an interview with one of Mrs. Thompson's former students, now a successful business owner, talking about how she had changed his life. The community is rallying around her, Mrs. Chen explained. People are sharing stories, organizing candlelight vigils outside the hospital. They're calling for changes in how we treat elderly patients, demanding better training for healthcare workers. Jenny watched as more comments poured in under the video. Former students, parents, community members, all sharing stories about Mrs. Thompson's kindness, her dedication, her impact on their lives. The woman Jenny had dismissed as just another demanding patient had touched more lives than she could have imagined. Go home, Mrs. Chen said gently. Take some time to think. But know this, whatever happens next isn't just about you anymore. It's about how we treat our elderly, how we handle burnout in healthcare workers, how we balance efficiency with compassion. As Jenny gathered her things from her locker, she passed by room 204 one last time. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Thompson sitting in her chair, looking out at the growing crowd of supporters below. Even now, there was that same quiet dignity about her, that same grace that made Jenny's actions seem even more shameful in retrospect. The local morning news played on Jenny's small TV as she sat curled up on her couch, still in her pajamas at noon. She hadn't left her apartment in 3 days. Empty coffee cups littered her coffee table, and her phone kept buzzing with messages she couldn't bring herself to read. The incident at Metropolitan General Hospital has sparked a nationwide conversation. The news anchor was saying, healthcare worker burnout and elderly care standards are now at the forefront of public discussion. Mayor Thompson is scheduled to hold a press conference this afternoon. Jenny clicked off the TV, but the sounds felt even worse. Her mind wandered back to her childhood, to summer afternoons spent with her grandmother. She remembered how her grandma would tell stories about her nursing days during World War II, about the importance of treating patients with dignity no matter how tired you were. A knock at her door made her jump. It was Nancy, the veteran nurse, holding a paper bag of fresh bagels and wearing a concerned expression. "You look terrible," she said frankly, pushing past Jenny into the apartment. "Have you been eating?" "I can't stop thinking about it," Jenny admitted as Nancy busied herself in the kitchen, making coffee. "Did you see the latest video? One of Mrs. Thompson's former students from 30 years ago flew in from Chicago just to support her. Apparently, she helped him get a scholarship for college." Nancy nodded, setting down 2 steaming mugs. "The whole thing has taken on a life of its own. But that's not why I'm here. Have you checked your email today?" Jenny shook her head. She'd been avoiding everything. Emails, phone calls, social media. The weight of public shame was too heavy. "Well, you should," Nancy said, pulling out her phone. "The nurses' union released a statement this morning. They're using this situation to push for better working conditions, mandatory break periods, and improved staff-to-patient ratios." She showed Jenny the email. The union representative had written a careful statement, acknowledging that while Jenny's behavior was inappropriate, it highlighted the dangerous effects of healthcare worker burnout. They included statistics about nurse exhaustion, workplace stress, and its impact on patient care. "And there's more," Nancy continued, scrolling through her phone. "Remember that patient in 307? The one who was there the night it happened?" She wrote a letter to the hospital board. She described how you had spent an hour with her teenage son earlier that day, calming his anxiety before his first major surgery. How you held her hand when she got the diagnosis. Jenny felt tears welling up in her eyes. She remembered that family, how scared they'd been, how much they needed reassurance. It felt like a lifetime ago. "The thing is," Nancy said gently, "one moment doesn't define your entire career, but it can change how you move forward. Look at this." She pulled up another article on her phone. It was about a new program being implemented at a hospital in Oregon, where they had introduced compassion breaks for nurses working long shifts. "People are talking about real changes now," Nancy explained. "Not just at our hospital, but everywhere. About how we can better support both healthcare workers and patients. Sometimes it takes a crisis to start important conversations." Jenny's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Tom, the orderly. He had sent a photo of room 204. Someone had placed flowers on Mrs. Thompson's windowsill, and more were arriving. The room was becoming a symbol of something larger than one nurse's mistake. "I spoke to Mrs. Chen yesterday," Nancy said, finishing her coffee. "The hospital board is considering using this as an opportunity for reform. They're talking about new training programs, better support systems for staff, special protocols for elderly care. They want to turn this crisis into something positive." Jenny looked up, surprised. "They want my help." Nancy smiled slightly. "They think you might have a unique perspective now. Sometimes the people who make the biggest mistakes become the strongest advocates for change." Outside, the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds. Jenny could hear children playing in the park across the street, their laughter carrying through her open window. For the first time in days, she felt a tiny spark of hope. "But first," Nancy said, standing up and pulling Jenny to her feet, "you need to shower, eat something real, and start thinking about how you're going to make this right. Because that's what nurses do. We fix things, even when they seem broken beyond repair." The seniors' community center buzzed with quiet activity as Jenny walked through its doors for the first time. She had spent the morning staring at her reflection, wondering if this was the right thing to do. The volunteer coordinator, a warm-faced woman named Rose, greeted her with a gentle smile. "So, you want to spend your suspension working with the elderly?" Rose asked, leading Jenny through corridors decorated with residents' artwork. "That's different. Most people would just stay home and wait it out." Jenny nodded, watching as elderly residents played cards, worked on puzzles, or chatted in comfortable chairs. "I need to understand better," she explained. "I need to do more than just say sorry. I need to really learn." The morning passed in a blur of introductions and activities. Jenny helped serve breakfast, joined a morning exercise class, and sat with a group of seniors who were sharing stories about their grandchildren. With each passing hour, she felt the weight of her mistake shifting into something else. Not lighter, exactly, but different. "You remind me of my granddaughter," said one elderly lady as Jenny helped her with her knitting. "She's always in such a hurry, too. Young people these days, running around like the world's on fire. But you know what? The world keeps spinning whether you rush or not." During lunch break, Jenny sat in the staff room, watching news coverage of Mayor Thompson's press conference on her phone. He stood at the podium, looking tired but determined. "This incident," he was saying, "has shown us that we need to do better. Not just for my mother, but for all our elderly citizens." The camera panned to Mrs. Thompson, sitting in the audience. She looked stronger now, more like the woman from those old newspaper articles. Jenny's heart clenched as she remembered their last interaction. "That's quite a story you're part of," said Bill, one of the center's regular volunteers, sitting down across from Jenny with his coffee. "But you know what I think? I think you're exactly where you need to be right now." Jenny looked around the break room, at the photos on the wall showing seniors at various activities. Dancing, painting, celebrating birthdays. "I keep thinking about my grandmother," she admitted. "About how I used to visit her in the nursing home. I get frustrated sometimes when she'd tell me the same story over and over." "And now?" Bill prompted. "Now I realize those stories were her way of staying connected, of being heard. Just like Mrs. Thompson that night. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She was just human." The afternoon brought more activities. Jenny helped with an art class, where residents were painting landscapes. One woman spent an hour mixing colors to get the perfect shade of blue for her sky. Jenny found herself slowing down, matching the peaceful pace of the room. "Look at this," said Rose, showing Jenny a letter near the end of the day. It was from a family member of one of the residents, thanking the center for making their mother feel valued and respected. "This is what it's all about. Every person here has a lifetime of stories, of achievements, of love. They deserve to be treated with dignity." As Jenny gathered her things to leave, she pulled out her notebook. She had been writing down ideas all day, suggestions for improving patient care, ways to help nurses cope with stress, programs to better understand elderly patients' needs. The pages were filled with insights she never would have gained without this experience. "Will you come back tomorrow?" asked Rose, seeing Jenny's enthusiasm. "We could use someone with your medical background for our wellness programs." Jenny smiled, her first genuine smile in days. "Yes," she said. "I think I will." She looked out the window at the setting sun, thinking about how different everything looked now compared to that fateful night shift. On her way home, she started drafting a letter, not just to Mrs. Thompson and Mayor Thompson, but to every elderly patient she had ever treated with less patience than they deserved. It wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. A step toward turning her biggest mistake into something meaningful, something that could help change things for the better. The letter sat finished on Jenny's desk, the result of countless drafts and tearful revisions. She poured her heart into every word, but still found herself hesitating to send it. Through her apartment window, she could see the hospital where it all began, its lights twinkling in the evening sky. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rose at the senior center. "Thought you'd want to see this," followed by a link to a video. Jenny clicked it, and her breath caught. It was an interview with Mrs. Thompson, her first public statement since the incident. Mrs. Thompson sat in a comfortable chair, looking elegant in a blue sweater. Her voice was steady as she spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately," she said. "About how one moment doesn't define a person's entire character." Jenny sat down hard on her couch, unable to look away from the screen. Mrs. Thompson continued, "When I was teaching, I saw countless young people make mistakes. The ones who grew the most were those who faced their errors head on and learned from them. The interviewer asked about the viral video, about the public outrage. Mrs. Thompson's response was surprising. You know, I spent 40 years in education. I've seen burnout. I've seen good people crack under pressure. What matters isn't the mistake. It's what we do afterward. Wiping tears from her eyes, Jenny picked up her letter. She'd written about her time at the senior center, about the lessons she'd learned, about her own grandmother. She'd included suggestions for hospital policy changes, ideas she'd developed while working with the elderly residents. The doorbell rang, startling her. It was Nancy, holding a newspaper. Had you seen this? She asked, spreading it out on Jenny's kitchen table. The headline read, Hospital Announces New Elder Care Initiative. Below was a photo of Mayor Thompson shaking hands with Mrs. Chen. They're implementing changes, Nancy explained excitedly. Mandatory breaks for staff, special training for elderly patient care, a new volunteer program connecting retired teachers with long-term patients. And look at this. She pointed to a quote from the mayor. Sometimes our greatest failures can lead to our most important improvements. Jenny's phone buzzed again. This time it was Bill from the senior center. One of our residents had a fall. Her family's upset about the hospital care. Would you come talk to them? Share what you've learned. Without hesitation, Jenny replied yes. She grabbed her coat and the letter. I need to drop this off first, she told Nancy. It's time. The hospital lobby was quiet when they arrived. Jenny approached the front desk, where the receptionist recognized her immediately. Oh, she said softly. Mrs. Thompson was asking about you yesterday. Jenny's hand tightened on the letter. She was. The receptionist nodded. She remembered how you'd helped another patient that day, the young boy having panic attacks before surgery. Said it showed your true character more than one bad moment. Tears threatened again, but Jenny held them back. She handed over the letter, officially addressed to both Mrs. Thompson and Mayor Thompson. Could you make sure they get this? As they turned to leave, they nearly collided with someone entering. It was Rose from the senior center, looking concerned. Jenny, I'm glad I caught you. Remember Mr. Wilson, the retired nurse who's been helping us? He had an idea after hearing your story. She explained that Mr. Wilson wanted to start a support group, healthcare workers and elderly patients meeting regularly to share perspectives, to understand each other better. He thinks you should lead it, Rose said. Your experience. It makes you the perfect bridge between both worlds. Standing there in the hospital lobby, Jenny felt something shift inside her. The shame was still there, but now it was mixed with purpose. Her phone buzzed one more time. A message from Mrs. Chen. The board would like to meet with you next week. Your insights from the senior center could be valuable for our new initiatives. As they walked out into the evening air, Nancy squeezed Jenny's shoulder. You know what the residents at the center keep saying about you? That you really listen to them. That you take time to hear their stories. Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. Jenny looked back at the hospital, at the window of room 204 where everything had changed. A new shift was starting, and she could see nurses going about their duties. Tomorrow, she would go back to the senior center. There was work to be done, bridges to build, and stories to hear. The mayor's office was warmer than Jenny had expected, with family photos covering most of the wall space. She sat nervously in a comfortable leather chair, watching as Mayor Thompson read her letter for the third time. His mother, Mrs. Thompson, sat quietly by the window, her hands folded in her lap. You've been busy, the mayor finally said, setting down the letter. The senior center staff couldn't stop talking about your work there. And these suggestions for hospital policy changes. He gestured at the papers spread across his desk. Jenny's throat felt dry. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but now the carefully prepared words seemed to vanish. She began, then stopped, choosing honesty over preparation. I needed to understand better, to do better. Mrs. Thompson turned from the window. Tell me about your grandmother, she said softly. It wasn't what Jenny had expected her first words to be. Taking a deep breath, Jenny shared the story she'd been carrying. About her grandmother's final years in the nursing home, about watching her vibrant personality fade as staff treated her more like a task than a person, about promising herself she'd never be that kind of nurse and then becoming exactly what she'd sworn against. The night it happened, Jenny continued, her voice shaking slightly. I'd forgotten who I was supposed to be. I'd forgotten why I became a nurse in the first place. The mayor leaned back in his chair, studying her. On his desk sat a framed photo of his mother in her teaching days, surrounded by smiling students. Mom told me something interesting yesterday, he said. She remembered you from before that night. You'd helped a young patient through a panic attack, spent an hour just talking to him. Jenny remembered, the teenage boy who'd been terrified of his upcoming surgery. She'd sat with him, shown him breathing exercises, told him funny stories about her own hospital experiences. That's the real you, Mrs. Thompson said quietly. Not the person from that night. I've been a teacher long enough to know when someone's acting out of character. She stood up, walking over to Jenny's chair. You know what I remember most about that night? Not your words, but how tired you looked. How overwhelmed. I should have seen it. I used to get that same look during exam season when everything felt like too much. The mayor cleared his throat. We've been talking to the hospital board, he said. They're implementing most of your suggestions. The buddy system for new nurses, the mandatory rest periods, the elderly patient communication workshops. But they need someone to help lead these changes. Jenny looked up, surprised. Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. Sometimes teaching comes in unexpected forms, she said. Sometimes our hardest lessons become our most important gifts to others. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Rose from the senior center, right on schedule. She carried a thick folder filled with letters, testimonials from residents about their hospital experiences, both good and bad. The mayor had requested them as part of his healthcare reform initiative. Your support group starts next week, right? Rose asked Jenny, the group they'd planned. Healthcare workers and elderly residents meeting to share perspectives had grown beyond their expectations. Even nurses from other hospitals had asked to join. Mrs. Thompson picked up one of the letters, reading it carefully. You know, she said, when I was teaching, I always told my students that mistakes are just lessons wearing uncomfortable clothes. The question isn't whether we'll make them, but what we'll learn from them. The mayor stood up, walking to his office window. Below, they could see the hospital in the distance. We're holding a press conference next week, he said, announcing the new initiatives. Mom, and I think you should be there. People need to hear your story, both parts of it, the mistake and the recovery. Jenny felt tears welling up, but these were different from the ones she'd shed in those dark days after the incident. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. Thank you, she whispered, looking at Mrs. Thompson. Not just for forgiving me, but for helping me become better. Mrs. Thompson reached out and took Jenny's hand. That's what teachers do, she said simply. We help people grow, even when the lessons are hard, especially when they're hard. 6 months had passed since that fateful night in room 204. The hospital hallway looked different now. Warmer somehow, with comfortable chairs placed at regular intervals and cheerful artwork donated by the senior center's art class brightening the walls. Jenny walked these corridors not as a regular nurse anymore, but as the head of the new elder care initiative. Look at this, Nancy said, catching up with her near the nurses' station. She held up her phone, showing Jenny the latest hospital satisfaction survey results. The numbers had improved dramatically, especially in elderly patient care. Remember when we thought this whole thing would end your career? Jenny smiled, watching as a young nurse took her mandatory break in the new staff relaxation room. Another change that had come from those dark days. The room had been Mrs. Thompson's idea, complete with comfortable couches and a small library. Speaking of changes, Nancy continued, your support group story made the National Healthcare Newsletter. 3 other hospitals in the state have started similar programs. They passed room 204, now marked with a small plaque. Thompson Family Elder Care Wing. Inside, a volunteer from the senior center was reading to a patient, part of the new companionship program that paired retired community members with long-term patients. Mrs. Chen wants to see you, Nancy said as they reached the administration wing. Something about expanding the program. The hospital director's office was busy with activity. Mrs. Chen looked up from a stack of papers as Jenny entered. Perfect timing, she said. The mayor just called. The state healthcare board wants to implement our elderly care protocols across all public hospitals. They're calling it the Thompson Protocol. Jenny sat down, thinking about how much had changed. The weekly support group she led now had a waiting list, with healthcare workers and elderly community members coming together to share perspectives and experiences. Each session began with someone telling their story, sometimes funny, sometimes sad, but always human. Oh, and this came for you, Mrs. Chen added, handing over an envelope. Inside was an invitation to speak at a national healthcare conference about burnout prevention and elderly care reform. The keynote speaker would be Mrs. Thompson herself. Jenny's phone buzzed. A message from Rose at the senior center. The art therapy program they'd started for elderly patients had received a grant to expand. Attached was a photo of today's class, with Mrs. Thompson teaching watercolor techniques to a group of patients. You know what the best part is? Nancy asked, poking her head back into the office. Watch this. She led Jenny to the break room, where the new nurse orientation was taking place. The trainer was showing a video. It was Jenny's story, but not just the viral moment of shame. It was the whole journey, told as a lesson in humility, growth, and the importance of seeing every patient as a person. Your mistake changed things, Mrs. Chen said quietly, joining them at the door. Not just here, but everywhere. Sometimes that's what it takes. One person brave enough to say, I was wrong, and I want to make it right. Later that afternoon, Jenny visited the senior center, where she now spent every Thursday. The residents greeted her warmly, some showing off their latest art projects, others eager to share stories about their hospital experiences, both good and bad. You've got that look again, Rose said, finding Jenny in the garden. The one that says you're thinking deep thoughts. Jenny watched as a group of medical students arrived for their new required rotation, spending time with elderly community members, learning to see beyond the charts and diagnoses to the lives and stories that made each patient unique. I was just thinking, Jenny replied, about how sometimes our worst moments can lead us to our best selves. If you told me 6 months ago that all this would come from that terrible night. Her phone buzzed one last time. A message from Mrs. Thompson. Dropping by the hospital tomorrow. Bringing cookies for the nurses' break room. Some lessons are best taught with chocolate chips. Jenny looked around at all the changes, big and small, that had grown from her mistake. The new protocols, the support programs, the bridges built between healthcare workers and elderly patients. But most importantly, the change in herself, the deeper understanding that every patient, every person, carried a lifetime of stories worth hearing. You know what Mrs. Thompson always says, Rose smiled, watching the students interact with the residents. Sometimes the hardest lessons teach us exactly what we need to learn.